Last time, the Templars began navigating a Holy Land and Kingdom of Jerusalem that was quickly becoming a shadow of its former self. Jerusalem, briefly back in Christian hands as a result of Frederick Hohenstaufen's negotiation prowess, fell to the Turks once again in the mid-13th century. Both the 5th and 6th Crusades failed to achieve anything, both armies wilting under the Egyptian heat beyond Damietta. Even the pious King Louis IX could not reverse Christian losses. At this point, Outremer is essentially just a strip of coastal holdings from Jaffa to Tripoli and up the Orontes River to Antioch. But back in Europe, business was booming. The Templars controlled vast tracts of land, owned crucial and lucrative shipping industries in key port cities, and loaned huge sums of money to the royalty of Christendom. But that success came with its own consequences. Success attracts attention, and as the Templar presence in Outremer waned, the question increasingly became, what need did Europe still have of the order? From the east like a plague, pun absolutely intended, the Mongol horsemen descended upon the Near East. This was not a shock. The West had for some time known that a force of ravenous, highly effective horse archers was approaching. In 1260, writing from Acre, the Templar master sent out dire warnings about the Mongol advance. Quote, "The Tartars, Mongols, advancing with an innumerable force, have already occupied and devastated the Holy Land almost up to Acre. Nor will Christendom be able to resist them unless supported by the powerful hand of God. Unless help is quickly brought, God forbid, a horrible annihilation will swiftly be visited upon the world." End quote. These warnings met with a rather uneven response. In fact, many people in Christendom welcomed the news that a hitherto unknown army was rapidly approaching, intent unknown. There were popular Christian prophecies that predicted the arrival of a mystical Christian king leading an invincible army that would restore the glory of Christ on earth. These were the so-called Priester John myths. In this case, the hope that the Mongols might actually prove to be a good thing was not entirely fantastical. The Mongols were known for their religious toleration and even willingness to convert themselves. Perhaps this army would prove a good thing after all. In 1260, the contest for the Holy Land came down to a single battle fought between the Mamluks and the Mongols. If the Mongols won, then the Christians would get to find out just how friendly these riders from the east were. But in what can only be described as a miracle from the Mamluk perspective, the invincible Mongols were beaten. At the springs of Goliath in Galilee, on September the 3rd, 1260, the Mamluks decisively defeated the Mongols, saving Muslim Syria from subjugation. The elimination of the Mongol threat freed up the Mamluk leader, whose name in the West has come down to us as Baybars, to pursue two parallel goals. First, he wanted to unite the various Muslim territories from Syria to Egypt, restoring the situation as it had been under Saladin. Second, he wanted to do Saladin one better and rid the Holy Land of the remaining Christian enclaves. He knew that so long as the Christians possessed coastal cities like Jaffa and Acre, they would always be a thorn in his side. In February 1265, he began the assault on Outremer in earnest, attacking Caesarea, which fell on March the 5th. Haifa surrendered shortly thereafter. On April 30th, barely 2 months after the assault began, Arsuf fell to Baybars. The following spring, 1266, Baybars returned, this time heading to Tripoli. At the same time, he turned his attention to the formidable Templar castle at Safad in June of that year. The fortress was considered impregnable, with towers over 50 feet tall, protected by 80 Templar knights, hundreds of sergeants, and 300 trained crossbowmen. Building the castle alone had taken 20 years and cost a fortune. Upon arrival, Baybars sent gifts and endeavored to cajole the garrison into surrendering. The Templars responded by flinging said gifts from the castle walls by catapult. Insulted, Baybars now swore he would put everyone inside the castle to the sword. His men went to work, digging mines to undermine the walls. That effort, however, came to nothing, and by mid-July Baybars was clearly frustrated. Switching tacks, Baybars sent public criers to stand within earshot of the castle and loudly proclaim that any and all Syrian occupants of the castle would be spared, an offer that was gratefully accepted by many mercenaries who did not share the Templar desire to fight to the last. Inside the castle, the knights held a council and decided to send out one of their number, Brother Leo, to treat with Baybars. Baybars was blunt during their meeting. He was offended at the Templar rejection of his gifts and intended to kill every last one of them. Leo, Baybars said, would suffer most of all, unless he took back a very specific message. Leo hurried back, quote, returned to the castle and told them, the Templars, that the Sultan had authorized a safe conduct for everyone, and that the Sultan himself would swear it in their sight. End quote. We will never know exactly what Leo believed, but he was sending them all to their dooms. The following morning, Baybars, as he specified, followed up his message by appearing before the castle walls and swearing to the garrison that if they surrendered, they would be escorted to Acre and set free. Sadly for the Templars, Baybars was not Baybars. Unwilling to sully his reputation by lying, Baybars sent out a decoy to make the promise. A promise the real Sultan had no intention of keeping. But the Templars were fooled, and on July the 25th marched out of the castle. Scarcely had the group gone half a mile when they were stopped, escorted to a small hill, and executed. All but two. One was sent on to Acre, so he could tell those left the kind of treatment to expect if they continued to resist. The other was Brother Leo. He converted to Islam and was spared. Losing the castle at Safad shook the Templars to their very core. They still controlled several key fortresses in Outremer, but none were the equal of Safad, which had fallen in only 2 months. Now, somewhat ironically, the Mamluks and Templars were quite similar, which is probably why they hated each other so much. Both were elite warrior castes. The Templar rule that provided an effective manual for their organization had its counterpart, a Mamluk code called the, I'm going to struggle with this pronunciation, Furusiya. Both had rituals of investiture. The key difference, however, was that while the Mamluks had become the state, the Templars had not. But while they did not control Outremer politically, the military orders shouldered an increasing percentage of the burden of defending it. So while they had to defend the Holy Land, they were ultimately beholden to the states of Christendom and a papacy that was becoming increasingly politicized. While protected in theory by the papacy, in practice, the Templars remained vulnerable, as Pope Clement IV himself pointed out. Quote, "If the Church removed for a short while the hand of its protection from you, you would not in any way subsist against the assaults of the prelates or the force of the princes." End quote. In 1268, Baybars attacked Jaffa, which fell in half a day on March the 17th. Nothing below Acre now remained in Christian hands. Baybars then continued north to hit Antioch, which, somewhat miraculously and surprisingly, was still in Christian hands. Bohemond VI, the ruler of Antioch, had, idiotically, allied himself with the Mongols, giving the Mamluks a pretext for the attack. By early May, Baybars was at the gates of Antioch. Bohemond was not there, but off in distant Tripoli. Without him, the citizens lost hope. Quote, "The citizens put up scant defense. When the city was taken, more than 17,000 people who were inside it were slain, and more than 100,000 people, both religious and lay, men, women, and children, were taken captive." End quote. After entering the city, the Mamluks locked the gates and went on a murderous rampage. This was the end of the line for the fabled city of Antioch. Antioch had a storied past going back before the Roman Empire, and was one of the great cities of the Christian East. Now it was reduced to a backwater, never to recover. Without Antioch, the castles controlling the region were pointless, and the Templars swiftly abandoned those within their control, effectively ceding the territory to Baybars. By 1268, only the county of Tripoli and the kingdom of Jerusalem's holding in Palestine remained, other than Cyprus. Those who remained realized their chances were slim. If they did not get reinforcements, there was no chance that Outremer would survive another assault from Baybars. Realistically, the West was in no position to save the Holy Land. Perhaps it could have if it really wanted to, but Europe was too divided to mount another large-scale crusade. That being said, 2 small missions from the West did delay the end. In October 1269, 2 bastard sons of King of Aragon arrived and tried to coordinate a campaign with the remaining Mongols. Said coordination never happened, and the first effort was wiped out, unceremoniously. The second effort was led by Edward, King Henry III of England's eldest son. He got there in 1271, made a few forays out of Jerusalem, and left the following year. Edward did manage to get Baybars to agree to a 10-year truce, giving the remaining entrepots a little breathing space. Even luckier, Baybars died mysteriously in 1277, which was crucial because the Templars had been as hapless as the Hospitaller and Teutonic Knights to resist the Mamluk surge. In 1273, William of Buja was elected the new Templar master. He realized his situation was precarious. Writing to King Edward I of England in 1275, he said, quote, "We found the land and its inhabitants almost completely inconsolable. We have found the state of the house of the temple weakened and more fragile than it ever was in the past. Food is lacking. There are many expenses. Revenues are almost non-existent. All the brothers' goods have been pillaged by the powerful Sultan, and revenues from beyond the sea cannot suffice to keep us alive. We have countless costs in defending the Holy Land and strengthening the castles that have remained. All this, we fear, will cause us to fail in our duty and abandon the Holy Land in desolation. It is on this account, in excuse for a failure of this sort, that we ask your Majesty to bring some suitable remedy, so that we cannot be blamed afterwards, should something disastrous happen." End quote. He did not know just how right he was. We have seen time and time again, when discussing the Crusader states, that these kingdoms simply could not stand on their own, particularly when dealing with a concerted effort to attack or destroy them. William Obulu had the bad luck to be the last Templar master who held any land in the Holy Land. He happened to be holding that last tract on May 18th, 1291. On that day, the Mamluks finally forced their way into Acre, the last main Christian holdout in Outremer other than Cyprus. Once again, the Mamluks had worked quickly, forcing their way in after a bombardment of 6 weeks and 1 day. Acre's defenders were outnumbered probably 10-1, so once the Mamluks were within the walls, there was not much that could be done. The moment the Muslims broke in, a hectic effort to get the women and children out through the harbor swung into action, but the seas were rough, and there simply wasn't enough time. William took the 10 to 12 men he had immediately on hand and sallied up to where he thought the breach might be, intending to stem the tide for as long as he could. They all reached the broken gate to see the Mamluks streaming in and immediately threw themselves into the fray. The Templars and Hospitallers on hand threw themselves time and time again into the Mamluk shield wall. But by mid-morning, their morale was shrinking. William was fighting on horseback alongside his men. When he raised an arm to signal a charge, he was struck in the armpit by a javelin. He knew that the wound was fatal and made as if to leave, when a group of Italians screamed at him that if he left, the entire defense would collapse. He called back as loudly as he could, quote, "My lords, I can do no more, for I am killed. See the wound here." He fainted, and as he did so, his men lowered him onto a blanket and carried him down to the docks. As they did so, if they turned, they would have seen the Sultan's banners raising themselves on Acre's walls. Escape from the beach proved impossible, so the men continued with their master to the Templar compound in the far southwestern corner of the city. William died that evening. The King of Cyprus, Hugh III, escaped to his kingdom. He was lucky. Most were killed or taken as slaves. Even the Patriarch of Jerusalem died trying to swim to a ship. By Monday, May 28th, even the Templar compound had fallen. The remainder of the Templars in the Near East did not wait to suffer the same fate. Those in Sidon sailed off on July 14th, leaving the city to its fate. The Mamluks found Tyre essentially deserted. Ditto for Beirut. By mid-August, even the once invincible Templar castles of Tortosa and Chateau Pellerin had surrendered. Outremer was no more. It would have been easy to conclude that every Templar believed that the cause was lost. Time to pack up and close up shop. Game over, etc., etc. But for James of Molay, elected master of the Templars in 1292, there was potential here. James was a veteran Templar, whose knowledge of their rules and procedures catapulted him to his current position. He was not a loved man, though. His enemies thought him greedy and quote-unquote miserly beyond reason. Still, James threw himself into the task of reconstructing the Templar membership in preparation for what he saw as the inevitable resurgence in the crusading movement. That all meant going through the same procedures of the past, which always began with the master making the well-worn journey to the west. And so off went James, hoping to reinvigorate the idea of crusading in Christendom. Like most, he was about to be disappointed. The news of Acre's fall hit Paris in early August. Pope Nicholas, for his part, demanded a clear plan of action to retake the Holy Land. He made recommendations for how to pay for a new crusade and was demanding that the military orders merge, a request that was becoming a constant demand in the West. The notion of merging the knightly orders was nothing new. It was first floated as early as 1274 at the Second Council of Lyon. Really, this push was the result of Frederick Hohenstaufen's intrusions into the Holy Land. His brief intervention intensified the competition between the Hospitallers and the Templars, and ever since, many in the West considered the division between the orders to be a major distraction. All this meant that as James traveled west, he was going to a Christendom that simultaneously supported the idea of another crusade, but also wanted to see some major reform within the order. James was able to duck the issue of amalgamation for a time. In April 1292, Pope Nicholas died, and the College of Cardinals took 2 years to pick a new pope. Then, Pope Celestine, their compromise choice, wound up fleeing Rome in December 1294 and was replaced by Boniface VIII. James was in Rome to see all this. His visit to the Eternal City did yield 2 tangible results. First, he managed to avoid the question of radical reorganization. Second, he secured important tax relief for the Templars. Boniface himself ordered King Edward I to allow exports bound for Cyprus to pass freely through his ports without duty. Now, during the second half of 1295, James of Molay went to England and France. By the end of that year, he was on his way back to Cyprus. His successes were moderate. He failed to drum up support for a new crusade, at least major support. But he did sidestep the question of a merger with Hospitallers and shored up some of the Templars' financial position. Amazingly, when he returned to Cyprus, James was able to orchestrate, I'll call it a mini-crusade, which allowed the Templars to reoccupy a tiny sliver of the Holy Land. The Templars raided around Acre in July 1300. Then, even more promisingly, they attempted to coordinate an attack on the former Templar castle of Tortosa with the local Mongols. Unfortunately, the Mongols failed to show up, and the Templars had to abandon their plans. The reality remained that unless the West was willing to commit to a major crusade, it would be nigh on impossible for the order to extend much beyond Cyprus. And suddenly, in 1306, James found himself worrying about much more than organizing another crusade. James found himself summoned by the Pope. It seems that the French king had been making some rather wild accusations. On November 15th, 1305, Pope Clement V was crowned the first of the Avignon popes. The Italians summed up his relationship with King Philip of France as follows: "You, Philip, command, and I, Pope Clement, will obey, and it will always be that way." The Italians were being a bit harsh. Pope Clement did not want to be a French puppet, but Pope Clement was an ill man, and his physical health would hamper the Pope on more than one occasion as future events unfolded. If Clement was sickly, Philip was the opposite: robust, tall, and handsome. He was also cold and distant, and cultivated an unapproachable and sacred aspect to his kingship. These were the two men, Philip of France and Pope Clement V, who would decide the Templars' final fate. On December 29th, 1305, King Philip IV promised Clement that he would take the cross and launch a new crusade. But it was a promise that came with two conditions, major conditions. He wanted to see the military orders not only reformed, but combined together and led by himself. An army of God led by the King of France. With such an army, he told Clement, Philip could easily take Jerusalem. In late summer 1306, two letters arrived in Cyprus from Pope Clement. The first requested a proposal for retaking the Holy Land. The second was a response to the idea of merging the Holy Orders. Now, in addition to dealing with these issues, James was in the process of initiating a huge new influx of recruits. The loss of the Holy Land had cost the Templars hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers. Of all existing members of the order, 80% had taken their vows since the fall of Acre in 1291. And there remained plenty to do besides warfare. The Templars were a major shipping magnate at this point. And let's not forget their oldest duty, Pilgrim Protection. Many pilgrims still came to the island of Cyprus to visit the tomb of the Apostle Barnabas. And some of these had to be discouraged from going further. For the moment, the Holy Land in Jerusalem itself was closed to Christian pilgrims. In response to the first letter, James began by making a very blunt point. It was impossible to do any major damage to the Mamluk holdings without a massive army, which he called a quote-unquote general passage. Overwhelming force, he argued, was the key. Quote, if you are willing to accept some advice on the numbers of peoples, I repeat what Baybars, more famous, powerful, and wiser in military matters than any one of his sect, has ever been said on many occasions, that he would confront 30,000 of the Tartars, Mongols, with his army, but that he would leave them in the field if their numbers were larger. Similarly, he said that if 15,000 Frankish knights came to his land, he, again Baybars, would meet and join battle with them. But if a larger number arrived, he would retreat and leave them the field. End quote. As to the second letter, James had to be much more nuanced. First, he argued that the military orders had been successful separately. This was a bit of a stretch, as the quote-unquote Holy Land, in Christian control, currently consisted of, well, Cyprus. Still, he argued the point. Further, he suggested that it would be dishonorable to force men who had given their oaths to serve one order to suddenly have to serve another. Moreover, each order owned tremendous tracts of land, ships, interests, etc. How could they be combined and keep the command structure in place? He also argued that competition pushed both the Templars and Hospitallers to excel. Quote, if the Templars transported to Outremer a large number of brothers, horses, and other animals, the Hospitallers did not rest until they had done as much or more. If one religious order had good knights, reputed for their fighting and other good actions, the other order always strove with all its might to have better ones. If the two orders had already been united, I, that's James, do not believe they would have made such great efforts. End quote. He did concede that a change might reignite some interest in monasticism in the West, but that was the only concession he was willing to grant. Letters in hand, James prepared to go west again in October 1306. He did not realize it, but he would never see Cyprus again. James's crossing was slow, and he missed his appointed meeting with the Pope by several weeks. It did not matter much. Pope Clement was too ill during that time to see anyone. Instead, upon arriving in France, James immediately started to familiarize himself with the medieval kingdom's current political situation. The Capetians had now ruled France for more than 4 centuries. During the 13th century, French kings had steadily increased their influence beyond the Ile-de-France and into what were formerly independent kingdoms of Normandy, Anjou, Brittany, and Toulouse. Philip IV himself was an imposing figure, as I mentioned earlier, but a man of little warmth and certainly not an intellectual. He was a zealot in his own way, but his personal piety was always closely tied to his self-interest. I think there's no better example of this than Philip's notorious conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. Basically, Philip wanted to seize church revenues to pay for his interminable wars. Benedict opposed this obvious interference with church property and issued his most famous bull, Unum Sanctum, which argued that the church was the supreme leader of Christendom and that all men, including kings, were required to follow the orders of the Pope. Philip vigorously disagreed. So vigorously, in fact, he sent armed mercenaries to Italy, who roughed up the Pope. Boniface, overcome with injuries both physical and mental, died 1 month later. It was this event that precipitated the Avignon papacy, as the popes no longer felt safe in Rome, ironically fleeing closer to France and the man who started all the trouble. As I alluded to a second ago, the catalyst for the Boniface controversy was Philip's need for money to pay for a series of wars. First, France fought a bitter and fruitless war against Aragon. Then, he fought a series of wars against Edward I of England over the latter's refusal to pay homage as the ruler of Gascony. By the time that James got to France in 1306, the kingdom's issues were not military. France was facing a full-blown monetary crisis. Philip, to try to solve his problems, had turned to the tried and true method of currency manipulation. Starting all the way back in 1295, Philip began to devalue the currency. This caused massive inflation, which crashed the French economy further, reducing the value of coin 3 times fold. So in 1306, Philip tried to reverse course, taking money out of circulation to slash inflation. The problem with this was that people got much less money back from the mint than they turned in. So everyone got poorer. The cost of living doubled overnight, and there was serious rioting in Paris on December 30th, 1306. So then Philip attempted another tried and true medieval response to an economic crisis. He attacked the Jews. Though expelled by Philip Augustus in 1182, the Jews had returned to France and were now, once more, expelled, their property seized. This decision, however, did not result in the windfall Philip IV expected, since the emergence of the Italian banking houses had seriously undermined the power and importance of Jewish banking families. This left Philip casting about for another rich group to raid. May 1307 found Philip in Poitiers, pestering Clement to allow him to put Pope Boniface VIII on a posthumous trial for a whole host of ridiculous crimes. This served a dual purpose for Philip. It satisfied his grudge against the Pope and rammed home the idea that he was a godly king. Clement tried to sidestep the issue, and it was not long thereafter that James of Molay appeared in Poitiers, just after Philip left. Unbeknownst to James, an agent of King Philip, William of Nogaret, had begun to compile a dossier on the Templars. The purpose of it remained unclear at this moment, but certainly the Templars, like any organization, had some skeletons in their closet. The first contributor to the dossier was a man called Esquin of Florian. Esquin was one of those beacons of virtue that we today would call the prison snitch. Around 1305, he shared a cell with a Templar who, according to Esquin, had divulged to him all kinds of dirty secrets and tales of immorality, which, according to this mysterious ex-knight, permeated the order. Not everyone was willing to believe Esquin. He began with King James II of Aragon, but James thought the whole story was preposterous and brushed him off. Esquin then took his lurid tale to France. Now William of Nogaret, he was willing to believe anything bad about the Templars. So he took these ideas and he just ran with them. He then had moles planted within the Templar Order, and by the time James of Molay arrived in Poitiers, there had been spies in the French branch of the Templars for 2 years. During the early summer of 1307, James made his way to Paris, where a general chapter meeting for the Knights of the Temple was set for June the 24th. Clearly, James believed that the major issue for debate would be the proposed merger with the Hospitallers. However, the French Templar chapter had stood firmly behind Philip IV during his fight with Pope Boniface, and that fact probably gave James a false sense of confidence that Philip would oppose the request to merge the orders out of loyalty to the Templars. Philip would have been present during the meeting, and what's interesting is that neither Philip nor William of Nogaret brought up anything about Esquin's allegations, even though this would have been the logical time to do so. At this point, there seems to have been some vague suggestion of sexual impropriety, all stemming from the kiss of peace that new recruits were required to give the Templar chaplain. Now, that's probably because there was nothing unusual at all about getting or giving the kiss of peace in the Middle Ages. Kisses of peace were a common part of nearly all feudal ceremonies. Instead, Philip decided to bring up and take issue with what to us would seem like a really minor point: improper confession. At some point, James conceded that he heard the confessions of fellow knights. James was not an ordained member of the clergy, so he should not have been allowed to do that. He was probably offering up what he felt was a minor infraction in the hopes of steering the conversation away from the merger. In fact, he likely tried to sell the confession process as a virtue, given that if confession could be made to a master, then the knights could confess more freely and more often. If so, James badly miscalculated. Philip was not looking to be persuaded as to the righteousness of the Templars. He was looking for evidence. By late August, James seems to have realized he had badly misjudged what the French king was after. So he wrote to the Pope asking for help. Clement wrote back to King Philip, explaining to the French monarch that the Templar master had personally asked for an inquiry to be opened for the papacy to investigate all the allegations that were suddenly coming up. From September the 1st to October the 15th, an inquiry would get to the heart of the matter, one way or another, wrote the Pope. Then, unfortunately for the Templars, Clement got sick. While the Pope was out of action, William of Nogaret decided to make his move in mid-September. Throughout France, William sent secret orders all about with instructions to open them 1 month from the date of the sending, and to follow the instructions to the letter. The secrecy worked. While on September the 30th, 1 brother fled the order, 3 more were initiated. Evidently, the Templars suspected nothing. In mid-October, James of Molay traveled to Paris to attend the funeral of the former Latin Empress of Constantinople, Catherine. At dawn the morning after the funeral, men moved into position, and they sprang the trap. Men wearing royal livery burst into every temple and every Templar dwelling that same morning. Each brother was demanded to surrender and come with them. The charges in the letters were truly heinous. Quote, "The brothers of the Order of the Knights of the Temple, wolves in sheep's clothing, in the habit of a religious order, vilely insulted our religious faith, are again crucifying our Lord Jesus Christ. The bailiffs are ordered to hold them captive to appear before an ecclesiastical court, seize their movable and immovable goods, until you receive further instructions from us, the king, on this matter." End quote. It was Friday, October 13th, 1307. Philip of France tried to force his kingdom to get on board with the arrests, sending around a flurry of public letters, wherein the kiss of peace at the beginning of the initiation ceremony became the gateway into a ceremony of Templar orgastic depravity. Quote, "There has recently echoed in our ears, Philip, to our not inconsiderable astonishment and vehement horror, vouched for by many people worthy to be believed, a bitter thing, a lamentable thing, a thing horrible to contemplate, terrible to hear, a heinous crime, an execrable evil, an indomitable deed, a hateful disgrace, a completely inhuman thing, indeed remote from all humanity. Having weighed up its seriousness, we felt the immensity of our grief increase in us the more bitterly as it became evident that the crimes of this nature and importance were so great as to constitute an offense against the divine majesty, a loss for the Orthodox faith, and for all Christianity, a disgrace for humanity, a pernicious example of evil, and a universal scandal." End quote. So it was that, according to quote-unquote credible evidence, the brothers entering the Templars were forced to deny Christ 3 times, spit on his image, remove their clothes before their receiver, and submit themselves to all kinds of fantastical sexual acts. Then, once they were brothers, again according to very credible people, everyone was required by their very vows to engage in sexual intercourse with one another and, quote, This is why the wrath of God has fallen on these sons of infidelity, end quote. As you could tell from the letter, for all the scandalized verbiage, Philip's letters were almost completely fabrications and hopelessly vague. Philip went out of his way to be vague, saying that further investigation went, quote, "The greater are the abominations that are uncovered, as when one knocks down a wall," end quote. He never bothered to specify what any of these further abominations even were. A second royal order, issued September the 22nd, was more revealing. The bailiffs, after taking the Templars into custody, were to impound and inventory all Templar property. Critically, they were to make sure that all the farmland, vineyards, etc., kept working. And here Philip shows his real hand. He had no intention of letting his hall go to rot. Most of the men arrested would not have matched our expectations for what the Knights of the Temple looked like. Most were middle-aged and decidedly unwarlike. 40% of those questioned were over 50 years old. Most Templars in France were neither warriors nor knights. They were farmers, carpenters, merchants, and managers. Virtually none had ever been to the Holy Land. All the same, the king's orders were to torture those taken, and we have zero indication that those orders were not followed. Medieval torture methods were not inventive, but they were effective. Think things like starvation, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, shackling, racking, foot burning, and the strappado, a device that pulls your arm backward and over your head until your shoulders separate. One Templar reported being kept in a pit so small he could not take more than one step in any direction, an experience to which he said death would have been preferable. The purpose behind all the torture was simple. Philip did not have the evidence he needed to convict the order. Now he had to manufacture it through confession. And the clock was ticking. James of Molay had been staying in Paris the night before the deceased empress's funeral. He was still there 3 days later when he made a formal confession before his inquisitors. He began his confession with the formalities. He had been a Templar for 42 years, having been received in the temple house at Bayonne between Dijon and Lyon. There, he was presented with a cross and told to deny Christ. James said he did so, but against his will. He was told to spit on the cross, but would not, instead spitting on the ground. He adamantly denied having sexual relations with his fellow brothers. The inquisitors wrote down the confession, and James was taken back to his cell. Up next was Hugh Aparriod. Hugh was in charge of one of the Templar houses in the West, and so he was given a lot more attention than James. The idea being that his confession could characterize Templar activity throughout all of France. He told his inquisitors that he denied Christ once. More importantly, he confessed to witnessing a litany of sexual sins during his time with the Templars, painting a picture of blasphemy and depravity in the order from the top down. The interrogations continued through the autumn of 1307 and into the new year, both at the Paris Temple and in provincial hearings across France. Each time, the inquisitors would read the same instructions before commencing. Quote, "They will be told that the king and the pope have been informed by several very trustworthy witnesses in the order of the errors and the buggery they commit particularly on their entry and their profession. They will be promised a pardon if they confess the truth and return to the faith of the Holy Church. Otherwise, they will be condemned to death." End quote. Given the promise of absolution if they confessed, and the certainty of death if they did not, one by one, from teenagers to old men, the Templars lined up and, after varied amounts of torture, confessed to what was becoming a script of offenses: illicit kisses, spitting on the cross, denying Christ, sex between brothers, worshipping brothers, etc., etc. Almost to a man, they told the inquisitors exactly what they wanted to hear. The speed with which the Templars rounded up and confessed was the key to the French strategy. Look, the Knights of the Temple were not the Jews. They were not social outcasts, and they had powerful connections. For this to work, the government had to work like lightning and push the Templars beyond redemption before any serious resistance could be mustered. On October the 25th and 26th, 1307, the most important Templars in custody were made to repeat their misdeeds in front of a specially convened audience of scholars from the University of Paris. James was trotted out again, by now a broken man who believed his only way to save his skin was to cooperate fully. Had James more sense, he might have realized that this was as neutral of a forum as he would ever get. If he made a stand here and spoke out, then he might have been able to save the order. After all, not everyone was pleased with King Philip's actions. James II of Aragon and Edward II of England opposed his sudden seizure of the Templars and their property. Pope Clement was appalled. Philip's attack on the Templars was a direct affront to papal authority. It was one thing for the Pope to be an ally of the French crown, but quite another to be his puppet. He wrote angrily to Philip that, quote, where ecclesiastical and religious persons could be harmed, he, Philip, must leave everything to the ecclesiastical courts, end quote. The Pope knew full well the Templars were being tortured, and he made that clear to Philip as well. He told Philip of his intention to investigate the Templars himself, and Philip had ignored him. And so now more forcefully, Clement demanded that the Templars and their investigation be turned over to him. If anyone was going to sit in judgment over the Templars, it was going to be the Pope. On November the 22nd, 1307, Clement sent out a papal bull known as Pastoralis Praementari to the crowned heads of Europe, in which he claimed that the Pope took precedence over the crowned heads of Europe in all matters related to the Church. Clement was sending a clear message to Philip. He was not going to allow the French king to destroy the Templar Order. To deal with Philip, Pope Clement took a very clever tact. He simply widened the scope of the inquiry. To date, only France had had the Templars arrested. Clement invited everyone else to do the same and question them, reminding everyone that he, the Pope, retained an open mind on the matter. Clement was clever enough to realize that not everybody shared Philip's hatred of the order. If he could not prove the Templars innocent in France, Clement figured he would just do so elsewhere. Clement's intervention meant that Philip would lose his monopoly over the proceedings. And so, in January 1308, Knights of the Temple were arrested in Aragon and in England. Without torture, it turned out that their stories changed quite a lot from the testimony in France. Moreover, because the size of the case had ballooned, the chances that Philip could get a swift resolution had all but vanished. Now, stepping back a second, in December 1307, A group of cardinals had been granted access to the Templars in Paris. Faced with kinder interviewers, their stories suddenly changed. By February 1308, the Pope had become concerned that all the evidence from France was tainted beyond usefulness. Now, Philip had to make a counter move. Perhaps he couldn't influence events outside France, but he could get all the Kingdom of France behind him, and that was saying something. Trying to take the moral ground, Philip argued that all the proceeds from the seizure of the Templars' property should immediately be put to use saving the Holy Land. After all, wasn't that the purpose of the order? But the Pope held firm. He wanted a crusade, but he wasn't going to fall for the trick. Pope Clement indicated he would judge the order himself, and he would take his time. He would not be bullied. Philip seethed in anger. On May 6, 1308, the papal bull Pastoros Primienti arrived in Cyprus. The acting leader of the order, James, the actual Templar master, of course, was incarcerated, began to make preparations for the likely opening of proceedings against them. But remember, Cyprus did not belong to the Knights of the Temple. It belonged to the king of Jerusalem, in this case, Amalric III. 6 days after the papal bull arrived, he followed suit and moved to arrest all the Templars, seizing their goods. Amalric should have been, in theory, an ally to the Knights of the Temple. But how could he protect them when their master had already confessed to blasphemy? Still, Amalric was in a much tougher position than Philip. The Knights of the Temple on Cyprus were not all merchants and farmers. They were amongst the best fighting men on the island, and they commanded several important castles. So instead of storming in, Amalric took a gentler tact. He politely asked the Templars to retire to one of their estates, pending resolution of the matter in France and elsewhere. The Templars gathered, debated, and agreed, retiring to one of their estates. There, they made a general statement proclaiming their innocence. Amalric, however, had a change of mind. He met with his advisors, and then on June 1st, 1308, the Templars on Cyprus were ambushed and imprisoned. They would remain so until the matter was resolved. It would be a miserable wait. It took nearly 2 years for proceedings to begin on Cyprus. Back in France, Philip's ministers changed their strategy, realizing Clement was not going to be bullied. So instead, they simply sent them all the confessions, all their evidence, and invited the Pope to come to his own conclusions. It was a smart strategy. By July 2nd, 1308, Clement had seen enough to convince himself either of the order's guilt or that he could at least accede to Philip's demands without looking like a puppet. We'll probably never know which was true. On August the 12th, he issued another papal bull, setting up parallel investigations. One investigating individual Templars, the other the order as a whole. He scheduled a general council of the church on October the 1st, 1310. Here, on the basis of all the evidence, he promised a final decision on the order's future would be taken. By August 1308, James of Molay had flip-flopped twice. First, taking back his confession, and then reasserting he had denied Christ once, he would confess to no more, in the hopes of obtaining a papal absolution. Across Europe, the far-flung process established by Clement now swung into motion. Across Christendom, bishops in different dioceses began an examination of the Templars' conduct. Their aim was different than Philip's, however. They hoped to secure confessions quickly, absolve the Templars, and move on. It was an exercise in bureaucratic terror. The questions were all the same. They were formulaic and numbing. Did the brother deny Christ at his reception? Was this done with the whole community? Was it repeated afterward? Were they taught that Jesus was not the true nature of God or a false prophet? Did they spit on the cross? Did they trample on the cross? Did they do it regularly? Did they urinate on the cross? Did they trample on the cross and then urinate on it? Did they urinate on the cross and then trample on it? Was this done at Easter? Did they deny the sacraments of the church? Did they confess to the master instead of to an ordained priest? Did they ever kiss another brother improperly? Where did they kiss him? On his back? His belly? Were they told that they could have sex with their brothers? Did they do it? Did they penetrate, or were they penetrated? Did anyone tell them that this was not a sin? Did they worship idols? Did the idols look like heads? Did the idols look like heads with 3 faces? How did they worship them? Did they call them God? Did they call them Savior? Did some of their brothers do this? Did most of their brothers do this? Did anybody tell them the idol would save them? Make them rich, make the soil fertile, make the trees flower, etc., etc. In the end, it actually did not matter much for the vast majority of the individual Templars. The Council of Vienna, where Pope Clement was supposed to issue his final decision, was postponed 1 year until October 1311. And by then, most of the Templars had simply given up or died. In just one part of France, 1/3 of the brothers who had been initially arrested were dead 5 years later. By the spring of 1310, from Ireland to Cyprus, the investigators had finished compiling all their evidence. But if you were to ask the French crown, there was no need for that. It had begun leasing out Templar properties the prior year, collecting all the rents as though it already owned them. The biggest problem for the Templars at this point was that Philip's strike hard and strike first policy had worked. There was no one left who could really mount an effective response. Sure, the Templar system worked great when you had an effective master, because he could direct everyone toward the same goal. But with James of Molay locked up and in no shape to resist anything, it was almost impossible for the Templars to mount a successful defense. Summoned again before Pope Clement on March 2nd, 1310, James of Molay was done. He didn't even try to confess or argue innocence. He simply asked Clement to render a judgment. So instead, the Templars had to go outside their chain of command. Across France, hundreds of brothers had been sent to Paris. But once there, they were generally allowed some freedom of movement. So for the first time, these men got to talk to one another and arrange some form of defense. Several high-ranking Templars started to complain to church officials. Why were they kept in such terrible conditions? What exactly were the grounds for their initial arrest? And why did the French king get to supplant the church in a purely ecclesiastical manner? In other words, a small group of Templars sought to destroy the case Philip had been building since Friday, October 13th, 1307. One Templar argued that the allegations of sexual impropriety were simply absurd. Quote, "Whoever enters this order promises 4 essentials, namely obedience, chastity, poverty, and the deployment of all his strength in the service of the Holy Land. He is received with the pure kiss of peace, takes his habit with the cross, which he wears permanently on his breast, and is taught to observe the rule and ancient customs handed down to them by the Roman Church and Holy Fathers." End quote. These men promised to appear before the Council of Vienna in October, and given the complete lack of evidence uncovered anywhere in Europe outside France, they might have stood a good chance. But Philip was not about to let that happen. This was never a fair game. So he shifted to the tactic that suited him best: intimidation. By intimidating the local archbishop, Philip managed to get the entire trial process stopped in its tracks. Instead, the archbishop just moved forward to render judgment without hearing hardly any of the evidence. One of the more active Templars left his own trial in disgust. It continued without him. Then, on the morning of May 12, 1310, a royal official appeared with a decree. According to the king, 54 of the Templars in attendance had been found to be relapsed heretics and were to be executed on the spot. Royal will now trampled any pretense of due process. Said Templars were immediately gathered up and taken through the streets of Paris to a field outside where dozens of stakes and pyres had already been set up. Each one of them was burned alive. And thus, in one single furious act, the French king crushed any semblance of Templar resistance. On July the 5th, 1311, the commissioners themselves were called before King Philip. He told them to stop work. They had, he decided, more than enough material. Outside France, the prosecution of the Templars varied sharply, depending almost completely on the character of the ruler in question. In the end, it wouldn't matter. The Council of Vienna opened in October 1311 and issued its judgment on March the 22nd, 1312. Many of the clerics who assembled were skeptical of the accusations leveled against the Templars. Still, Philip was determined to send a message, so he kept a full standing army only 20 miles away from where the council was debating. The message was clear. Clement could either suffer the fate of Boniface VIII or accept the truth that the reason he was pope was because of Philip, and now he needed to pay the piper. The decision regarding the Templars was issued in a papal bull, Vox in Excelsis, a voice on high. In it, the Pope clearly made his choice. He fawned on Philip IV and simply repeated the list of blasphemies and misdeeds that had been heaped upon the Templars, as though each one of them had been completely proven in court. He then announced his final decision. Quote, "These confessions render the order very suspect. The infamy and suspicion render it detestable to the Holy Church of God, to her prelates, to kings and other rulers, and to Catholics in general. It is also believed that in all probability from now on, there will be no good person who wishes to enter the order, and so will be made useless to the Church of God and the carrying on of the undertaking to the Holy Land." End quote. The Templars were never given a chance to defend themselves. Instead, Clement continued, quote, "Therefore, with a sad heart, we suppress, with the approval of the Sacred Council, the Order of the Templars, and its rule, habit, and name, by an inviolable and perpetual decree, and we entirely forbid that anyone from now on enter the order, or receive or wear its habit, or presume to behave as a Templar. If anyone acts otherwise, he incurs automatic excommunication." End quote. With the stroke of a scribe's pen and the application of the papal seal, the Order of the Knights of the Temple came to the end. It had existed for 292 years. Gone was any suggestion that the military orders might be merged. In May 1312, it was further decided that the Templar property across Christendom would fall to the Hospitallers. In theory, this was good news for them. But in reality, the Hospitallers knew full well that they would need to fight for every inch of soil, every single cow. With the Templar property parceled out, Christendom still had to decide what to do with the hundreds of prisoners to be rehabilitated or rehomed. Most of these men had spent the vast majority of their lives with the Templars. What were they supposed to do now? The unrepentant were given life in prison, but most were forgiven. These men were sent to live in other monastic institutions. In December 1313, Pope Clement turned his attention to James and his 3 remaining important colleagues. But the Pope had apparently seen quite enough of the Templars. He formed a panel of cardinals to examine the 4 brothers. This panel decided that the 4 were to suffer, quote, hard, perpetual imprisonment. James evidently could no longer stand the indignity. He had done everything the Pope demanded. Why was he still to be punished? So, much to the shock of the audience, he decided to speak out. He began to scream about his innocence until a marshal stepped forward and punched him in the mouth to shut him up. He was dragged by his hair into a chapel. Because he had spoken, James knew he had condemned himself as a heretic. On the morning of March the 18th, 1314, James was taken out to a small island in the middle of the River Seine. James of Molay stripped to his underclothes without shivering from cold or fear. As he was tied to the stake, he asked to be allowed to say a prayer. Then he uttered the following, quote, God knows who is in the wrong and has sinned. Soon misfortune will come to those who have wrongly condemned us. God will avenge our death. End quote. The fires were stoked, and James of Molay, the last master of the temple, heir to Hugh of Pons, was gone. Between October 13th, 1307, and March 18th, 1314, the Templars, one of the most connected and powerful organizations in Europe, was completely crushed. James's final prayer seems to have been heard. Within the year, Pope Clement and Philip IV, the 2 men who had done more than anyone else to destroy the Templars, were dead. Philip, only 46, suffered a fatal stroke while hunting. When Dante completed the Divine Comedy in 1320, his readers found Pope Clement V condemned to hell. The Teutonic Order, which we will turn to in our next deep dive, did not survive too much longer, even though they did establish a state of their own. By the mid-14th century, their fortunes had begun to wane. By the beginning of the 16th, they held only a rump of territories in the Holy Roman Empire. The order was officially dissolved by Napoleon in 1809, though it had really come to an end 400 years earlier. The Hospitallers' time came in 1522, when Suleiman the Magnificent and the Ottomans blasted them off the island of Rhodes. Remarkably, however, they were not wiped out. Of the 3 military orders, the Hospitallers today are the only ones who still technically exist. Today, the Templars remain an object of intense public interest, much more so than either the Teutonic Knights or the Hospitallers. To a large extent, that is because of how the Templars met their end. They were an order steeped in secrecy, and that secrecy proved to be part of their downfall. And then there is the Holy Grail, which of course is not history. The link between the Templars and the Holy Grail actually starts with the Parzival epic from the Arthurian legends. The knight, Parzival, goes on a search for the Holy Grail, which, according to the Arthurian legend, was protected by a military order called the Templars. They help the Fisher King watch over the Grail in their temple. Templars now does not translate to Templars, but this is the origin of the link between the Templars and the Holy Grail. Now, even in their own day, the Templars were much more interesting subjects than the Teutonic Knights or the Hospitallers. They corresponded perfectly with the medieval chivalric ideal of knighthood. They were knights who swore to a religious ideal. They served a higher calling than themselves. And then there was the manner of their fall, which stoked the imaginations of Europeans literally since October 13th, 1307. And more interesting than any of the fantasies is the rise of the Freemasons, an order that arose in England and France and copied the Templars in so many ways. The Freemasons used secret handshakes, covert symbols, and rituals galore. They self-consciously sought to connect themselves with the Templars. So, in a way, the Knights of the Temple, founded by Hugh Aparriod, are still with us. And so is, of course, the legend of Friday the 13th.